Welcome to Greek for a Week. I'm glad that you are continuing to walk through the book of First Peter with me. And this week we begin both a new chapter as well as a new paragraph. So this week we're looking at chapter 4, specifically verses 1 and 2, in the larger paragraph of verses 1 through 6. And I've titled this particular paragraph Conduct Toward Others. And you'll also notice then here in a few weeks that verses 7 through 11 will have the same title for the paragraph, because I really think we are dealing with a paragraph that is chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. But I wanted to break it up into a couple paragraphs just for the ease of diagramming it here in a few weeks. Okay, verse 1. Peter says, "Therefore, since Christ has suffered," with reference to the flesh, he says, "you also arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, because the one who suffers with reference to the flesh has ceased from sin, for the purpose of," or you could say in order to live, the remaining time in the flesh, no longer through the lusts of men, but the will of God. All right, so the word un here is our connector. So that is a conjunction that will connect us to the preceding paragraph, which is, again, a very typical way for biblical authors to connect paragraphs and to connect sentences and so forth, the use of the conjunction. Here, the un resumes the thought of chapter 3, verse 18, speaking of Christ's suffering in the flesh. It also introduces a connection to be made later in verse 6. The Christou here, Christou, and the pathontes, or thontos. That's a genitive absolute. So we have an aorist active participle, masculine genitive, singular. And what happens is the word Christou, it marks a switch from the subject of the genitive participial phrase, which is Christou pathontos, and it switches it to the subject of the main clause, which is humes. Let me just mention a few things in relationship to a genitive absolute. Again, some rules or some necessary pieces of information when noting a genitive absolute. Remember that you need to have a noun or a pronoun in the genitive case. You need to have an anarthrous participle in the genitive case, which anarthrous just simply means there is no article that precedes the genitive participle. And there's no grammatical connection with the rest of the sentence. However, it does sustain a thought connection with the rest of the sentence, and that is the case here. Sarki, I've labeled that as a dative of reference here. And then the apa lesaste, here's your imperative of apa litzo, arm yourselves. So that would be kind of the main thought throughout verses 1 and 2, is arm yourselves with a similar way of thinking. And hati, here's your motivational grounds for the imperative. Then lastly, you have a substantival participle, the ha pathon. That is an aorist active participle, masculine nominative singular of pasco. Then we drop down, you have the ace ta, and then here's your infinitive here, by oi sai. Okay, so there is your purpose clause, if you will, ace ta plus the infinitive. And then your me keti and your Allah. That is a negative positive construction, no longer doing this, but doing this. So no longer living, if you will, or be controlled by the lusts of men, but rather you're living by or controlled by the will of God. And then both of these here, the epithumias and the thelemati, both of those are datives of rule, which just simply means that it's according to or in conformity to. Again, no longer in conformity to the lusts of men, but rather you're in conformity to the will of God. So that's, I think, Peter's point there in verses 1 and 2. And we'll see then how that continues to move forward through the rest of the paragraph. Trust you have a great week. Next week, we'll look at verses 3 and 4.